Emily stood outside the courthouse, the air chilly as she adjusted her simple jacket. It wasn't much, but it was all she could afford. Her hands shook slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the situation. Today, she was standing up against a legal system she didn't fully understand, at least, not in the traditional sense. A woman from a humble background, she had no law degree, no fancy connections, and no expensive suit to wear. What she had was a fierce belief in justice and a determination to see this case through to the end. Her case wasn't a simple one. It was about fairness, about standing up for what she believed was right. And even though her opponent was a corporation with lawyers and resources far beyond her own, Emily refused to back down. Her heart beat fast, her mind racing with the details of the case she had studied for weeks. She wasn't going to let them walk all over her. Walking through the heavy courthouse doors, Emily could feel the tension in her stomach, but she didn't let it show. As she entered the courtroom, she saw Judge Mitchell sitting at the bench, looking every bit the confident, imposing figure that everyone said he was. His dark suit, graying hair, and steely eyes made him look like a man who had been in control of the courtroom for decades. His reputation for being tough on those who tried to challenge him was well known, and many had said that no one dared to question his authority. The courtroom buzzed with low conversations as Emily made her way to the stand, her simple clothes seeming out of place in the sea of sharp suits and polished shoes. The judge looked up from his papers as she approached, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. He had been told that a simple woman from the small town had decided to represent herself, and he couldn't help but feel a little amused. He had seen many before her, people who thought they could challenge the system with little to no knowledge of the law. Most of them had folded under his sharp questioning and quick decisions. He expected the same from Emily. "You may begin," Judge Mitchell said, his voice calm, but laced with a hint of condescension. The trial had been going on for what felt like weeks. Each day, Emily had stood her ground in the face of the corporation's lawyers, who tried every tactic they knew to make her doubt herself. Judge Mitchell, too, had continued with his thinly veiled criticisms, but Emily had become accustomed to his interruptions. She had learned to keep her cool, no matter how much he tried to rattle her. The question, however, remained: could she win? The days after the CEO's testimony passed in a blur. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the tide had finally turned. She had done everything she could to expose the cracks in the corporation's defense. She had asked the hard questions, pressed them on their inconsistencies, and most importantly, she had shown that she wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right even in the face of overwhelming odds. But the battle wasn't over yet. As the trial entered its final phase, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The courtroom was quiet now, the tension almost unbearable. She had faced the corporation's legal team, the CEO himself, and even Judge Mitchell's sharp interruptions, but all of that had led to this moment. The decision was in the judge's hands, and she couldn't deny the nerves that had started to creep in. Judge Mitchell had been quiet since the CEO's testimony, his usual stern expression replaced by something more contemplative. Emily couldn't read him. He had been harsh and dismissive at the start of the trial, but now, there was something different about him. Perhaps it was the way she had challenged the corporate giants, or the way she had turned his own courtroom against him. Whatever it was, Emily could sense that things had shifted. The judge stood up and motioned for the court to come to order. His voice was calm but carried the weight of finality. "We are now at the point where both sides will present their closing arguments. Miss Carter, you may proceed." Emily stood, her hands slightly trembling as she adjusted her papers. This was at the final stretch. She had no legal training, no powerful law firm behind her. But she had something far stronger: the truth, the facts, and a determination that had kept her going through the most difficult moments. She took a deep breath, looking around the room. The eyes of the entire courtroom were on her. The judges, the lawyers, even the spectators, all waiting for her to speak. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. I stand here not as a lawyer, but as a person who believes in fairness. I've spent weeks in this courtroom, listening to the testimony, examining the evidence, and doing everything I can to seek justice not just for myself, but for everyone who has been taken advantage of by this corporation's deceptive practices. She paused for a moment, glancing at the judge. He was watching her closely, his face unreadable. She pressed on. The company has claimed that it operates within the law, that it provides its customers with clear terms and conditions. But time and time again, we've seen the opposite. The terms are buried in fine print, hidden behind legal jargon, and designed to confuse the very people they are supposed to protect. The CEO himself admitted that the company provides all the necessary information, but he couldn't answer the most important question: how many people actually understand what they're signing? Emily's voice grew firmer, her confidence building as she spoke. The truth is that the company has been making a profit off the confusion and ignorance of its customers. It has built an empire on complex contracts and hidden fees, and it's done so knowing that most people won't take the time or have the resources to challenge it. That's where I come in. She glanced at the opposing side, where the corporation's lawyers were sitting, their faces a mixture of disdain and disbelief. I may not have a law degree, but I know what it means to be wronged. I know what it feels like to be deceived. And I won't stand by and let this continue. I've done my research. I've listened to the witnesses. And I've asked the right questions. What we have here is a clear case of corporate greed taking advantage of everyday people. Emily turned her attention back to the judge, who had been listening intently. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for justice. The law is supposed to protect the people, not the corporations. And if we allow companies like this to continue, if we let them get away with these deceptive practices, then we are all at risk. The courtroom was silent now. Emily could feel the weight of her words, the power of her conviction. She knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been taken advantage of by the system, everyone who had ever been overlooked because they didn't have the money or the connections to fight back. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but unwavering, I ask that you consider the truth here. The facts speak for themselves. This corporation has used its power and resources to mislead and deceive. I ask that you rule in favor of fairness, in favor of the people who have been wronged. We deserve better than this. There was a long silence as Emily finished speaking. She returned to her seat, her hands still shaking slightly, but she knew she had done everything she could. Now, it was up to the judge to make the final decision. Judge Mitchell stood up, his face hard to read. He walked to the front of the courtroom, pausing for a moment before speaking. Miss Carter, he began, his voice measured, I must admit that your arguments have given me much to consider. You have presented your case with clarity and conviction, and I believe you've raised valid points about the company's practices. This court will take all of that into account. Emily held her breath. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she waited for the judge's decision. That said, Judge Mitchell continued, the law is not about emotions or personal beliefs. It is about facts and evidence. And while I may not agree with everything you've said, I cannot ignore the evidence you've presented. The company's actions have been, at best, questionable, and at worst, exploitative. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Was this really happening? Was the judge going to rule in her favor? Judge Mitchell paused again, his eyes scanning the courtroom. I believe that the corporation has failed in its duty to its customers. The terms and conditions they provide are unclear and deceptive, and it is the responsibility of this court to ensure that justice is served. The room was silent, every person hanging on the judge's next words. Therefore, I rule in favor of Miss Carter, Judge Mitchell said, his voice firm. The corporation must revise its contracts, making them clear and accessible to all customers. The company will also be required to compensate those who have been wronged by these unfair practices. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. The judge had ruled in her favor. She had won. For a moment, she just sat there, stunned. She had fought so hard, and now, the truth had prevailed. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been misled by the system, everyone who had ever been told that they didn't matter. As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the trial, Emily felt a surge of emotion wash over her. She had done it. She had stood up to the system, and she had won. The courtroom began to empty, but Emily remained in her seat for a moment longer. She looked up at Judge Mitchell, who had already turned his attention to the next case. For the first time, she saw him differently. The man who had tried to humiliate her, who had underestimated her at every turn, had just given her the greatest victory of her life. Emily stood up, her heart still racing, and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. She had proven that even the simplest person could stand up against the odds and win. And that, more than anything, was the true victory. That morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thicker than ever. There was a palpable sense of anticipation. Today, the most important witness of all would take the stand, the CEO of the corporation. He was the man at the top, the one who had made the decisions that had led to this lawsuit. Emily knew that if she could expose the truth here, in front of this man, she would have a real shot at winning. As the doors to the courtroom opened, a wave of murmurs swept through the room. The CEO walked in, flanked by his lawyers. He was tall and imposing, with a well-tailored suit that screamed authority. His face was calm, but there was a sharpness to his eyes that hinted at the weight of his position. He was used to being in control, used to having the final say. And today, he would be facing Emily. The judge nodded toward him as the CEO took the witness stand. He didn't make eye contact with Emily at first, instead focusing on the judge and the rest of the room. His presence seemed to fill the entire courtroom, his confidence radiating as he prepared to testify. Emily, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. She had studied this man's public statements, his company's practices, and everything that had led to this moment. She was ready. The CEO's voice was smooth as he began his testimony. He spoke about the company's commitment to transparency and customer satisfaction. He claimed that everything the corporation had done was within the boundaries of the law. He painted a picture of a responsible, ethical company, one that cared deeply about its customers. Emily listened carefully, not allowing herself to be distracted by his polished words. She had heard it all before, the carefully crafted statements, the appeals to authority. What she needed to do was find the cracks in this perfect image, the inconsistencies that could bring the truth to light. After he finished his initial statement, Judge Mitchell turned to Emily. "Miss Carter, it's your turn. You may begin your questioning." Emily stood up, her heart racing but her mind sharp. She knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. She walked confidently to the witness stand, every step measured and deliberate. The courtroom fell silent as she began. "Mr. Thompson," she started, addressing the CEO by name, "you've said that the company operates with transparency and cares about customer satisfaction. But I have a few questions about that. Can you explain why the terms of the contracts are so complex, with clauses hidden in fine print? Do you truly believe that your customers are fully aware of what they are signing?" The CEO looked at her, his expression still calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "The terms of our contracts are designed to protect both the company and the customer," he said smoothly. "It is standard procedure. We make sure that the terms are available to anyone who wants to read them." Emily didn't miss a beat. "But are they easily accessible? Are they written in a way that an average person, someone with no legal background, can understand? Or are they buried in jargon that most people can't decode?" The CEO hesitated for a moment, his face stiffening. "The terms are clear, Miss Carter. Anyone can read them and ask questions if they have concerns." Emily could see that he was starting to shift in his seat. She pressed on. "Let me ask you this, Mr. Thompson. How many customers do you think actually read through the entire contract before signing it? How many do you think fully understand what they are agreeing to?" There was a brief silence before the CEO spoke again. "Our customers are responsible for reviewing the terms before agreeing to them. We've made sure that all necessary information is provided." Emily shook her head. "But is that really enough? Is it truly fair to expect people, who might not have the time or resources to carefully examine a contract, to understand what they are signing? Doesn't the company have an obligation to make the terms clearer?" The CEO's calm demeanor began to crack. "We provide all the necessary information, Miss Carter. If someone chooses not to read it, that's on them." Emily felt a surge of frustration, but she kept her composure. "But isn't it the company's responsibility to ensure fairness, to make sure that customers are not misled or taken advantage of? Isn't it true that the company deliberately makes the terms difficult to understand, so that customers unknowingly agree to unfavorable conditions?" The CEO's face reddened slightly, but he didn't answer right away. The silence in the courtroom seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Emily could feel the tension building. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she could push him into a corner, when his carefully constructed facade could begin to fall apart. Finally, the CEO spoke, his voice tight. "That is not true. The company operates within the law. We've done nothing wrong." Emily didn't let him off the hook. "Then why are there so many complaints from your customers? Why are there countless reports of people being charged unfair fees and being trapped in contracts they didn't fully understand?" She could see that her words were having an effect. The CEO's carefully controlled image was starting to crack. He was beginning to look uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as if trying to find a way out of the line of questioning. "Your company's practices are in question, Mr. Thompson," Emily continued, her voice steady. "And I'm here to ensure that people like me, people who have been wronged by your company, are given a voice. The truth can't be hidden anymore." Judge Mitchell leaned forward in his seat, his sharp eyes focused on the exchange. He had been a part of the legal system for decades, and in all his years, he had rarely seen such determination from someone who wasn't a trained lawyer. Emily's questions were direct, pointed, and backed by research that he hadn't expected from her. The CEO's face had turned a shade darker, and his voice grew more defensive. "Miss Carter, I think we're done here. This is not the forum for your accusations." But Emily wasn't done. "No, Mr. Thompson. The people deserve answers. The court deserves answers." The CEO's composure faltered for a moment, and in that instant, Emily knew she had won. She had broken through his polished exterior and exposed the cracks in his company's practices. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been taken advantage of by corporate greed. As the session ended for the day, Emily felt a rush of pride. She had faced the man at the top and had made him uncomfortable. She had done what no one expected her to do. The courtroom had been on her side, and even Judge Mitchell, who had tried to keep her in check, had been forced to watch as she dismantled the CEO's defense piece by piece. Emily knew that the battle wasn't over, but for the first time in this trial, she truly believed she had a chance to win. She had exposed the truth, and now, it was up to the judge to make the right decision. The next morning, Emily woke up early, her mind still buzzing from the events of the previous day. She had gone to bed late after reviewing her notes and preparing for the trial, but despite the exhaustion, she felt an unusual sense of calm. The ridicule from Judge Mitchell still echoed in her mind, but it no longer made her doubt herself. Instead, it fueled her determination. She had proven to herself that she could handle the pressure, and now it was time to show everyone else. As the days passed, Emily found herself feeling more at ease in the courtroom. The initial shock of standing before Judge Mitchell and the intimidating presence of the corporate lawyers was starting to wear off. Each day, she grew more confident, more certain of her ability to navigate the complexities of the case. It wasn't that the pressure had disappeared, but it had become more manageable. Emily knew her arguments were solid, and she had prepared herself for every possible angle the opposing side might throw at her. That morning, as she sat at the defendant's table, flipping through her notes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The atmosphere in the courtroom was different, charged with a tension she hadn't sensed before. She glanced around, noticing that more people had begun to fill the seats. It seemed that word had spread about the woman who was challenging a corporation in court with nothing but her determination. Emily couldn't help but smile at the thought. She might not have been a lawyer, but she had something even more powerful, the belief that what she was doing was right. Judge Mitchell entered the room with his usual solemnity, his dark robe sweeping behind him. He didn't acknowledge Emily right away, but she could tell that today would be different. His eyes briefly flickered toward her as he settled into his chair, and for the first time, there was a slight hesitation in his gaze. It was almost as if he was assessing her not just as the defendant, but as a worthy adversary. Emily felt a strange sense of pride. She had earned his attention. The trial began, and Emily once again faced the daunting task of questioning witnesses for the corporation. The first to take the stand was a lawyer from the company's legal team. He was polished, wearing a sharp suit and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had dealt with countless cases. As he took his seat, Emily couldn't help but notice the smirk on his face, the kind that seemed to say, "I've got this in the bag." She knew that he was just another part of the system trying to overpower her with their experience and resources. But Emily wasn't intimidated. She stood up and walked to the witness stand, her heels clicking softly on the floor. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on her as she began to speak. "Mr. Adams," she said, her voice steady, "you represent the corporation in this case. Can you tell me, first, how the company ensures its customers fully understand the terms of its contracts?" The lawyer shifted slightly in his seat. "Well, Miss Carter, as I've stated before, the company provides all relevant information in the contract. The customer is given ample opportunity to read and sign it before agreeing to the terms." Emily didn't let him off the hook so easily. "But is the information provided in a way that an average person can understand? Are the terms clear, or are they buried in fine print and complex legal language?" Mr. Adams hesitated, his confident smile faltering. "The terms are standard, Miss Carter. They are legally binding and have been upheld in numerous cases." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "But is that fair to someone like me, who doesn't have a law degree, who doesn't know how to decipher legal jargon? Is it truly fair to expect the average person to sign something they don't fully understand?" The lawyer stammered for a moment, clearly caught off guard by her directness. "The company's position is that the terms are clear and reasonable. If anyone has any questions, they can always seek legal counsel." Emily took a deep breath, then pressed on. "But if the average person can't understand the terms, doesn't that suggest that the company has a responsibility to make the terms more accessible? To make sure that everyone is truly informed before signing something so important?" There was a brief silence in the courtroom. Mr. Adams shifted in his seat again, this time looking uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to speak but quickly closed it, as if searching for the right words. Emily could see that her questions had struck a nerve. She wasn't just asking about the specifics of the case, she was challenging the very notion of fairness in the corporate world. She could feel the weight of the judge's eyes on her. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was up to her to water it. "Mr. Adams," she continued, "don't you think that by providing unclear terms, the company is taking advantage of people who don't have the means to fully understand what they're agreeing to?" Shouldn't the company be held accountable for making things clearer? The lawyer looked as if he was about to respond, but before he could, Judge Mitchell spoke up. Miss Carter, I think we've heard enough. Let's move on to the next witness. Emily didn't let the interruption shake her. She had made her point. The seed of doubt had been planted, and she knew it would take root. She returned to her seat, her mind already racing ahead, preparing for the next round of questioning. As the trial continued, Emily faced more witnesses, each one from the corporation's team. Each time, she kept her composure, never allowing herself to be intimidated or flustered by their polished appearances or legal expertise. She was prepared for every question, every attempt to derail her. And each time, she struck back with clarity and precision, using their own words against them. There was a moment when Judge Mitchell interrupted her again. This time, his voice was sharper, more forceful. Miss Carter, are you going to continue with this line of questioning, or are you going to focus on the facts of the case? His tone was laced with impatience. Emily met his gaze without flinching. Your Honor, the facts are exactly what I'm addressing. This case isn't just about what happened to me, it's about the broader issue of corporate responsibility. The facts speak for themselves, but they need to be seen in context. Judge Mitchell narrowed his eyes, clearly not used to being challenged so directly. But Emily wasn't backing down. She had seen enough of the way the system operated to know that sometimes, the truth had to be dragged out, piece by piece. And she was willing to do whatever it took to bring it to the surface. As the day drew to a close, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had faced the corporation's witnesses and had stood up to the judge's interruptions. She had proven, once again, that she was more than capable of handling herself in this battle. And as she looked around the courtroom, she could see that the people in the seats, the attorneys, the courtroom staff, even the judge, were starting to take her seriously. But Emily knew that this was just the beginning. The real test was still ahead of her. She had to face the final witness, the one who held the key to her victory or defeat, the CEO of the company. This would be the ultimate showdown, and Emily wasn't about to back down now. She had come this far, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The courthouse was much busier today. As Emily entered, she could feel the weight of the stares from the other lawyers and the courtroom staff. Word had already spread about the young woman who dared to represent herself against a powerful corporation. Some people looked at her with curiosity, while others were already doubting her abilities. But Emily was used to being underestimated. She had spent her whole life proving people wrong. Judge Mitchell was already seated at the bench, his usual air of confidence in place. When he saw Emily enter, he didn't acknowledge her right away. Instead, he shuffled through his papers, pretending to be engrossed in his work. Emily, however, didn't let this faze her. She took her seat at the defendant's table and opened her folder, going over her notes one last time before the session began. As the trial resumed, Judge Mitchell wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. He called the first witness to the stand, one of the corporation's senior executives. The man was dressed in an expensive suit, his polished demeanor showing that he had been in the courtroom countless times before. The judge introduced him with a slight nod of approval, as if to say, "This is the type of person you're up against." The executive began to speak, laying out the corporation's side of the case with a calm, practiced voice. He spoke of the terms and conditions that Emily had supposedly agreed to, how the company had followed all the proper legal procedures. Emily listened carefully, taking notes as the witness spoke, her mind working quickly to connect the dots. She knew this was going to be tricky, but she had prepared for moments like these. After the witness finished, the judge turned to Emily. "Well, Miss Carter, it's your turn," he said, almost sounding like he was daring her to mess up. Emily stood up, her heart racing slightly, but her mind clear. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her. She walked up to the witness stand with a quiet confidence, her steps echoing in the quiet courtroom. The judge watched her closely, no doubt waiting for her to stumble, but she had done her homework. She knew what she needed to ask. "Mr. Johnson," she began, addressing the witness by name, "you mentioned that the company followed all legal procedures. Can you please clarify what specific terms you are referring to in the contract?" The witness, surprised by her directness, cleared his throat before responding. "The terms are clearly stated in the agreement. We have provided all the necessary information to the customers." Emily nodded, making a note on her pad. "And this information was provided in a way that a person like me, with no legal training, would be able to understand." There was a moment of silence as the witness fumbled for an answer. "Well, of course," he said, though it sounded less convincing now. "The terms are simple, and we make sure that everyone is informed." Emily raised an eyebrow. "I beg to differ, Mr. Johnson. I may not be a lawyer, but I've spent a lot of time looking through that contract, and I can tell you it's anything but simple. In fact, some of the terms are hidden in fine print, and others are written in legal jargon that most people would never understand." The witness shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's the standard procedure," he said, his voice growing defensive. "It's how these things work." Emily leaned in slightly, her tone calm but firm. "But is it fair to expect an average person to sign an agreement without understanding the full implications? Wouldn't you agree that the company has a responsibility to make these terms clear?" The witness hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. "Well, it's a standard contract. Everyone who signed it agreed to it." Emily's eyes never left him as she continued. "But the terms are designed to favor the company, not the consumer. They're designed to confuse and mislead. Wouldn't you agree that the company has a responsibility to ensure fairness in its dealings?" There was a long pause. Judge Mitchell, who had been watching intently, finally spoke. "Enough of the theatrics, Miss Carter. Stick to the facts." But Emily wasn't done. She looked directly at the judge and then back at the witness. "Your Honor, the facts are exactly what I'm addressing." The witness is avoiding the point. "The company has failed to provide clear and honest information. This is about transparency and fairness, which are basic principles of justice." The judge frowned, clearly irritated by her persistence. "You've made your point, Miss Carter. But let's move on." Emily returned to her seat, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. She had just planted a seed of doubt in the witness's testimony. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else off easy. She had learned one important thing from the judge's condescension: never back down, no matter how hard they try to push you. As the trial continued, Emily stayed focused, keeping her attention sharp. The more she listened, the more holes she found in the corporation's case. She carefully questioned each witness, always looking for inconsistencies or contradictions. Every time Judge Mitchell tried to rush her or undermine her arguments, Emily pushed back calmly and confidently. At one point, Judge Mitchell seemed genuinely irritated. "You do realize, Miss Carter, that you are not a lawyer," he said sharply. "You are not qualified to be questioning witnesses in this manner." Emily didn't flinch. "I may not be a lawyer, Your Honor, but I am a person who knows what's right. I'm doing my best to seek justice for myself, and for everyone who might be in the same situation." There was a slight pause as the judge processed her words. For a moment, Emily thought she saw something like respect flicker in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. Judge Mitchell had underestimated her from the beginning, but now he was starting to realize that she wasn't just some simple woman who could be pushed around. The session ended for the day, and Emily left the courtroom feeling more confident than ever. The judge had tried to intimidate her, to make her feel small, but she had held her ground. She wasn't finished yet, and she wasn't about to let them win. Outside the courtroom, The buzz of conversation was different now. People were talking about her, not just her case, but the way she had conducted herself, calm, knowledgeable, and unafraid. Emily knew she had made an impression, but she also knew there was more work to be done. The hardest part was yet to come, and she couldn't afford to relax. But for the first time, she felt like she might just have a real chance at winning. Emily took a deep breath and stood tall. She had practiced this moment in her mind countless times, but now that she was standing there, facing the judge, it felt different. The room seemed to grow quieter, and all eyes were on her. She could feel the weight of their expectations. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been underestimated. The thought of that gave her strength. She began to speak, her voice steady despite the nervousness bubbling inside her. Your Honor, I stand before you today because I believe in fairness. The situation I am in may seem small to some, but to me, it's a matter of principle. The company I'm up against has been unfair, and I believe that the law is on my side. Judge Mitchell gave her a long, scrutinizing look, clearly unimpressed. You believe the law is on your side, he asked, his tone laced with doubt. And you think you're qualified to interpret the law? Emily blinked, taken aback by his dismissive tone, but she refused to let him intimidate her. I may not be a lawyer, Your Honor, but I've spent countless hours researching the law and studying past cases. I've learned more about this case than most would in years of legal study. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Oh really, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Tell me, then, what specific legal precedent are you going to cite? Emily stood a little taller, her heart racing, but her mind clear. In this case, there is a precedent from a case just 2 years ago, where the ruling was in favor of an individual over a corporation under similar circumstances. The ruling was based on a clear violation of consumer rights, and I believe that the same applies here. The judge let out a small chuckle, clearly enjoying the moment. So you've done some reading, he said, the words mocking her. But reading law books and understanding law are two very different things. Let's see how well you do under pressure. Tell me, Miss Emily, she interrupted calmly, Emily Carter. Miss Carter, Judge Mitchell continued, if you really think you can win this case, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding of a few legal concepts. Let's see if you can even handle the basic terms. The judge's words stung, but Emily didn't flinch. She had prepared for this moment. She had prepared for him to belittle her, to challenge her at every turn. She knew that this was part of the test, how well she could hold her ground in the face of adversity. Please proceed, Your Honor, she said, her voice firm. Judge Mitchell smirked and began firing off legal terms and questions that most people would have struggled to answer. He asked about tort law, contract law, and specific cases that had been decided decades ago. Each time, he waited for her to falter, to trip up. But Emily didn't. She answered each question with clarity, even explaining the terms and concepts that had once seemed foreign to her. The room was quiet as Emily spoke, her calm and confident demeanor slowly starting to make an impression on the courtroom. The judge, though still skeptical, couldn't help but notice that she was answering his questions with surprising precision. His smirk began to fade, and he leaned forward in his seat, watching her more intently. As the questioning continued, Emily's knowledge grew deeper. She spoke about case law that directly related to her case, pointing out how previous rulings supported her position. Her voice never wavered, even when the judge tried to throw her off with difficult follow-up questions. Each time, Emily calmly addressed his concerns, adding more weight to her arguments. The judge was starting to feel the heat. He had expected her to crumble under pressure, to make a mistake, to reveal her lack of understanding. But instead, she was proving to be more than he had anticipated. She wasn't just repeating legal jargon, she was making sense of it, using it in ways that made him think. She was challenging his assumptions. As the session drew to a close, Judge Mitchell dismissed the court for the day, his usual air of superiority replaced with an almost visible frustration. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she was just another simple woman who would be easily pushed aside by his authority. But Emily Carter had proven him wrong. As she walked out of the courtroom, she felt a wave of relief. She had faced the judge head-on and had not only survived, but had stood tall in the face of his mocking. The journey was far from over, but she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer just the woman he had dismissed. She was a force to be reckoned with.